So when you find a mistake, what do? Okay? You admit the mistake and you right the ship. We haven't admitted the mistake and we haven't righted the ship.
Robert Lustig has become a celebrity of sorts for his stance on sugar, calling it a poison and a toxin. This particular video is quite possibly the most popular video in the history of nutrition, and has led many people to believe the same. Even we were thoroughly convinced by the man's arguments for years. However, as we continue to learn more, it has become clear that most of what Dr. Lustig states is what he claims to be fighting against: propaganda. It's time to address this behemoth. If nothing else, I hope to show you all how easy it can be to make a convincing argument with logical fallacies and misrepresented scientific references.
So, in order to get you in the mood, as it were, let's start with a little quiz. What do the Atkins diet and the Japanese diet have in common?
You already know what he's going to say, that they both eliminate sugar. They also both have very little processed food in general, focusing on whole foods. One heavily restricts dietary fat, the other dietary carbohydrate, yet both seem to get people lean and healthy. This is important because it seems that restricting one of these two macronutrients can have beneficial effects when it comes to metabolism. In fact, even Dr. Lustig seems to acknowledge this.
So the Atkins diet, of course, is all fat, no carb. The Japanese diet's all carb, no fat. They both work. Because energy expenditure and quality of life are the same thing. Things that make your energy expenditure go up make you feel good. Things that make your energy expenditure go down, like starvation, hypothyroidism, make you feel lousy.
Wow, I couldn't agree more. It would be nice if you were to dive in on the topic of the thyroid a bit more, but I know exactly why you didn't. Carbohydrates, and sugar in particular, have beneficial effects on thyroid hormones, allowing the conversion from the inactive T4 hormone into the active T3 hormone. Table sugar actually increases energy expenditure after consumption more so than other carbohydrates. It's funny how he says this, then calls soda liquid poison, which is caffeine and sugar, two pro-energy expenditure substances. Unfortunately, there is a lack of consistency with his ideas.
We are all eating more now than we did 20 years ago. Teen boys are eating 275 calories more. American adult males are eating 187 calories more per day. American adult females are eating 335 calories more per day. No question, we're all eating more.
This was recorded in 2009, so what he is saying is technically true. The United States was eating more in 2009 than in 1989, but the chronic disease epidemic did not start in the 90s and 2000s. By 1989, we were facing record levels of obesity, diabetes, and total chronic diseases. In the 1930s, these problems were a fraction of what they are now, yet data from the USDA indicates that the median intake of calories was around 3,500, up to around 4,500. This is 1,000 to 2,000 calories more than we were eating in 2009, yet a moderately active male was expected to weigh 154 pounds. In 2009, we were consuming around 120 pounds of sugar per person per year, and in the 30s, we were eating around 110 pounds. We were eating more total food, about the same amount of sugar, yet chronic disease and obesity were negligible compared to 2009, so these factors cannot explain it either. Dr. Lustig conveniently ignores the fact that sugar consumption peaked at the turn of the century and has decreased ever since, yet obesity shows no signs of slowing down.
So what happened? We did it. We've done it. 40% down to 30%. And look what's happened to the obesity, metabolic syndrome, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, cardiovascular disease, stroke, prevalence, all jacked way up as our total fat consumption as a percent has gone down. It ain't the fat, people. It ain't the fat. So what is it? Well, it's the carbohydrate.
Fat as a percentage of calories may have gone down since the 60s, but total fat consumption has gone up. If you're going to make an argument about what causes obesity, it pretty much has to be the fat, since storing carbohydrate as fat is essentially non-existent unless you're eating 500 grams of carbs or more per day.
What else is in Coke? We'll get to the sugar in a minute. What else? Salt. 55 milligrams of sodium per can. It's like drinking a pizza.
This doesn't even make sense. 55 milligrams of sodium is literally 2 grains of salt. Basically nothing. Just one slice of pizza contains more than 10 times that amount.
How'd this happen? Why did it happen? So this is where the politics comes in. This is the perfect storm. And it was created from 3 political winds that swirled around all at the same time to create this perfect storm. Second political wind, the advent of high fructose corn syrup. Okay? So this was invented in 1966 at Saga Medical School in Japan by a guy named Takasaki, who's still alive. And it was introduced to the American market in 1975. So high fructose corn syrup is evil, but it's not evil because it's metabolically evil. It's evil because it's economically evil. Because it's so cheap that it's found its way into everything.
I'm really happy for you. I'm gonna let you finish.
But isn't this whole presentation supposed to be about why it is metabolically evil? Is it or is it not? As I showed before, the consumption of corn syrups has also gone down since the late 90s.
Okay, the third political storm, okay, that swirling around to create this disaster, this mega typhoon, okay? That thing that happened in 1982. The USDA, the American Heart Association, the American Medical Association, all telling us we had to reduce our consumption of fat. Now, why did they tell us that? To stop what? To stop heart disease, did we? No, we didn't, did we? Okay? In fact, it's worked the exact opposite. We've only created more.
Okay, still gonna let him finish, but we actually do have less heart disease today than we did in the 80s. Likely due to the decline in smoking commercial cigarettes.
So now, how did this come to be? Why did they tell us to stop eating fat? Well, in the early 1970s, we discovered something in our blood called LDL, low-density lipoproteins. You've heard of that, right? Is it good or bad? Not so bad. We'll talk about it. In the mid-1970s, we learned that dietary fat raised your LDL. So if dietary fat is A and LDL is B, we learned that A led to B. Okay, dietary fat definitely increases your LDL, no argument, it's true. Okay? And then finally in the late 1970s, we learned that LDL correlated with cardiovascular disease.
This is a massive topic, and if you're interested, we did an entire 40-minute documentary on the cholesterol and dietary guidelines saga. Long story short, the bigger issue of the time was the type of fat, not the total fat. They put an emphasis on polyunsaturated fats because they decrease cholesterol, unlike saturated fats which increase it. So no, all dietary fat does not increase LDL. You know what does though? Sugar. Since Lustig says that LDL is not so bad, something I would agree with, this seems like an important point to gloss over. The dietary guidelines told us to eat more polyunsaturated fat, less saturated fat, and less sugar. Lustig argues that since low fat became the fad, that we started to replace it with sugar. But again, we eat pretty much the same amount of sugar today that we did in the 70s.
Percent calories from fat correlates very nicely with coronary disease, right? Except for one little problem. Anybody see it? Japan and Italy. So how much sugar do they eat? Didn't I tell you the Japanese diet eliminates fructose? They never even had it till we brought it to them after World War II. Italy, you know, aside from gelato, I mean, what else they got? Okay? They got a lot of pasta, there's a lot of glucose, but no fructose.
It's interesting how Dr. Lustig does not bring up one of the most popular talking points about the 7-country study, that there were actually 22 countries and Keyes cherry-picked 7 of them. I know why he doesn't though, because he would have to talk about France, probably the most notable exclusion from the original study. The French eat a high saturated fat and high carb, high sugar diet, yet historically have very low rates of heart disease.
Everybody, am I debunking? Yes? No? All right. Let's keep going. So everybody knows that LDL correlates with cardiovascular disease, and that's true, and I'm not going to argue that, that is true, but it's not this one. Pattern A LDL. These guys are so light, they are buoyant, they float. So they get carried through the bloodstream, and they don't even have a chance because they're so big and they're so buoyant, they don't even get underneath the edge of the endothelial cells in the vasculature to start the plaque formation process. But over here we have this other guy over here called pattern B, or small dense LDL. You see the difference? These guys are dense. These guys don't float. These guys are small. They get underneath the edge of the surface of the endothelial cells, and they start the plaque formation. And it's been shown by numerous investigators now that small dense LDL is the bad guy. Dietary fat raises your large buoyant. What do you think raises your small dense? Carbohydrate.
This is correct. Large LDL is considered safe and small, dense LDL more of a risk. However, neither are the cause of atherosclerosis. That would be oxidized LDL. The oxidation of LDL particles is required for atherosclerosis. The only reason that small, dense LDL is more of a risk factor for heart disease is because these particles are more prone to oxidation. We don't really care if there are more small, dense LDL particles if they do not become oxidized. One study looked at low-fat, high-carb diets in comparison to low-carb, high-fat diets, and found that the amount of oxidized LDL particles were slightly lower in the high-carb group. So if we use Lustig's own logic and call carbs A, small dense LDL B, and oxidized LDL C, we would say yes, A may lead to B and B may lead to C, but A does not lead to C.
I am going to show you a lot of reactions in excruciating detail. If you've studied biochemistry, you will have an anaphylactic reaction. If you haven't studied biochemistry, you will fall asleep. So what I'm going to suggest that you all do is just let me do my thing to show you that at least it works, and just count the arrows. Okay? You can do that, right? Can you just count the arrows? It's not like counting sheep. Okay? You can count the arrows, and just stick with me, okay? Just let me do my thing, and let me show you why fructose is not glucose. So number one, fructose is 7 times more likely than glucose to do that browning reaction, the advanced glycosylation end products. The thing that happens on your grill happens in your arteries for the same reason.
You know what's funny? Dr. Lustig is doing the exact thing that the people who say saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease do. The very people he's supposed to be arguing against. They like to say that bacon grease clogs pipes so it'll do the same thing in your arteries. Cute analogy, but anyone who has a semblance of understanding of physiology will tell you that's bullshit. Same thing here. What he's referring to is this reaction in a test tube. Yes, fructose is much more reactive than glucose, but it is also present at about 1% the concentration of glucose in the blood, where these glycation products are formed. There is little evidence suggesting that high fructose consumption actually leads to more AGEs, the browning products he is referring to.
All right, so now let's talk about a different carbohydrate. Let's talk about my favorite carbohydrate, maybe yours too. Okay, ethanol. Ethanol is a carbohydrate, isn't it? Here's the structure, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. It's a carbohydrate, but we all know that ethanol is a toxin, right? A poison.
This is one thing he really loves, comparing sugar to alcohol. He hits you with all these reactions and expects you to just sit back in awe and just accept that he is right, that they are the same. Fortunately, that's why we have experiments. I think this is hilarious because fructose can actually protect against several of the deleterious effects of alcohol consumption. For instance, one problem with alcohol is that it can cause you to go hypoglycemic, which fructose co-ingestion helps protect against. It also lowers the relative amount of alcohol in the blood, which reduces the toxicity for the rest of the body. Most importantly for Dr. Lustig, fructose helps protect against the liver fat accumulation, the elevation in blood triglycerides, and free fatty acids that ethanol induces. I recommend checking out this article by my buddy Dan M. of the Cows Eat Grass blog for more on this topic.
But all 60 calories of fructose are going to be metabolized by the liver. Why? Because only the liver can metabolize fructose.
Will you cut that out?
Anybody ever heard of uric acid? What is it? It's a waste product. Goes out in your urine. Causes what disease? Gout, right. Okay? It also causes another disease called hypertension. We have a hypertension epidemic in this country. Here it is. It's the sugar.
Okay, this is something I see way too often in the health community in general, conflating acute and chronic responses. The low-carb people will say things like, oh my god, look at the spike in blood sugar, as if a 30-minute peak in blood glucose means you'll get diabetes. It's the same thing here from Dr. Lustig. Yes, uric acid and blood pressure can be elevated right after ingesting sugar. Eating meat can acutely elevate uric acid, and drinking water can momentarily spike blood pressure. Does this mean that the hypertension epidemic is really caused by all the water we drink? Of course not. This is why before you give blood samples into the lab, they always make sure you are fasted prior. They are aware how acutely food can skew the data.
Because uric acid, turns out, blocks the enzyme in your blood vessels called endothelial nitric oxide synthase. And that's the enzyme that makes this stuff called nitric oxide, NO. And that is your endogenous blood pressure lowerer.
Nitric oxide is not our only source of vasodilation. We also have carbon dioxide, which has tons of important functions in the body, including the regulation of blood pressure. Carbohydrate metabolism produces significantly more carbon dioxide than fat metabolism does. Specifically, fructose activates the enzyme that helps produce carbon dioxide from carbohydrates and inhibits the enzyme that degrades it. There's one study that really destroys Lustig's entire argument. This study was 10 weeks, controlled feeding, giving subjects anywhere from 8 to 30% of their calories from pure white sugar. They adjusted the intake so that the people would maintain their weight. The people eating the most sugar consumed over 430 grams of carbohydrates and nearly 300 grams of sugar daily. They ended up eating the most calories of any group, despite weighing the least at baseline. This indicates that the sugar was actually able to boost their metabolic rate, since all of the groups ate enough to maintain weight. In the end, no differences in inflammation, blood pressure, glucose, uric acid, nothing.
What's up, Doc?
So here's normal medical students, if you can call them normal, okay? Taking in a glucose load, notice almost none of it ends up as fat. Taking in a fructose load, same number of calories, 30% of it ends up as fat. So when you consume fructose, you're not consuming a carbohydrate, you're consuming fat. So everybody talks about a high-fat diet. Well, a high-sugar diet is a high-fat diet. That's the point. That's exactly the point.
Okay, I think our friend Rob might have gotten a little excited about this graph and ended up forgetting to read the rest of the study. To quote directly, fructose stimulated fractional de novo lipogenesis, that means making fat from carbs, to greater than 32%, whereas glucose had essentially no effect, which is what Lustig is referring to. Let's keep reading though. The absolute rate of conversion of fructose to fat still represented less than 10% of the fructose load ingested, however, and the absolute rate of hepatic de novo lipogenesis remains small, less than 1 gram of palmitate synthesis per hour. So Lustig is incorrect in saying that 30% of the fructose ends up as fat. The 30% figure is the percentage of new fat made that came from fructose, not the percentage of fructose that went into making fat. Even if 30% of the fructose was converted to fat, that still means that the vast majority of the fructose stays as carbohydrate. So to say,
so when you consume fructose, you're not consuming a carbohydrate, you're consuming fat.
Is wildly inaccurate. And even if it did, wouldn't that be a good thing according to Dr. Lustig, since he's arguing that we should be eating less sugar and more fat? It just makes no sense on any level. Let's keep reading though. Long-term fructose in the diet, 15% for 3 weeks in a eucaloric diet, did not alter fractional or absolute de novo lipogenesis in the fasted state or in response to acute fructose ingestion. Thus, fructose has a striking qualitative effect on de novo lipogenesis, but not an important quantitative one. They also mention in the previous paragraph that this is a very small number compared with dietary intake of fat, which is typically around 100 to 200 grams per day.
So here we are. Hypertension, inflammation, hepatic insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, dyslipidemia, muscle insulin resistance, obesity, and continued consumption. Looks like metabolic syndrome to me.
At this time, I'd like to introduce a man by the name of Walter Kempner. Dr. Kempner pioneered what is known as the rice diet, a diet pretty much of pure refined carbs and white sugar. This diet was used to reverse both diabetes and obesity. It is impossible to still argue that sugar on its own can somehow cause these conditions when a nearly pure sugar diet was one of the most successful ways to treat them. This is the best argument I have against this entire presentation. It could not be more clear-cut.
Fiber is supposed to be an essential nutrient, and we can talk later if you want, after the cameras turn off, as to why fiber is not an essential nutrient, because the government doesn't want it to be.
Because it's not essential. If you don't eat fiber for your whole life, you won't develop any fiber deficiency syndrome.
That's why.
I'm not sure what the argument for the government not wanting it to be essential is, considering many of the big food companies that are in bed with the government have many products that advertise how much fiber they have.
So, why is exercise important in obesity? Number two, it's your endogenous stress reducer. It's the single thing that actually stress reduces.
That's the only thing that reduces stress. It's not like the literal stress hormones are called glucocorticoids, meaning their primary function is to increase blood glucose in response to there not being enough carbohydrate around. Wouldn't it be crazy if we showed that eating sugar actually lowers the stress hormones? That would really be the nail in the coffin.
Okay, so why is fiber important in obesity? So this is my motto in clinic. When God made the poison, he packaged it with the antidote. Okay? Because fructose is a poison. I think I've hopefully shown you that. Okay? But wherever there's fructose in nature, there's way more fiber.
Ever heard of honey? Nature's most concentrated source of sugar that also happens to contain zero fiber? I guess we should tell all the hunter-gatherers who eat tons of honey that it is not a good food source, but in fact, God is poisoning them.
Plus, there's a new literature that shows the more sugar the pregnant woman drinks or eats during the pregnancy, the more that gets across the placenta and actually causes what we call developmental programming, changing the kid's adiposity even before the kid is born and driving this whole epidemic even further.
This part is also hilarious because he doesn't mention that pregnant mothers preferentially convert glucose, which is apparently harmless, into fructose, a so-called poison, to feed their fetus. So what can we learn from a presentation like this? It's really easy to put together an argument using complicated scientific references that seem to make sense, especially when you talk with the conviction that Dr. Lustig does. It wouldn't be such a big deal, but people have been using the talking points that he has put forth for over a decade now, to the point where he feels comfortable campaigning for a sugar tax. That's where I see a big problem. Even if you think sugar is bad, or you think I'm wrong, it's important to always look into issues on your own, and don't take someone's word for it just because they're a doctor or they throw around studies.
It's entirely possible
that Dr. Lustig has good intentions, and that he thinks he's doing what's best for the world. It's important to constantly be questioning your own beliefs, even ones you may have already accepted as facts, in order to combat confirmation bias. I mean, we've had this man in several of our videos before. Dr. Lustig, if you're watching this and want to clear the air, by all means, we'd love to hear a response.
The only thing it's missing is sex. But we can see what we can do about that too.
If you'd like to donate to us in an easier and more secure fashion, we are now accepting cryptocurrency, and you can find our various wallet addresses in the description, along with our Patreon, Twitter, and Instagram. Either email us or message us on Patreon after your donation, and we will give you personalized, in-depth answers to any of your burning questions. Don't let them fool you. Subscribe to our channel.